It all started when I lost my job. What I didn't expect was that the hardest part wouldn't be the job loss itself, but losing the one person I thought would stand by me through it all. When she walked away, I was left wondering if I'd ever understand why. But years later, fate threw us together again, and what I found out changed everything. It all started when I lost my job. Everything changed in an instant. One day I had a steady job that provided for my family, and the next I was out of work, facing the reality of financial strain. It wasn't just about losing my paycheck. It was about the weight of uncertainty that suddenly loomed over us. What would we do? How would we make ends meet? The panic set in, but I tried to keep it together for the sake of my family. At first, my wife was supportive, trying to reassure me that we'd get through it together. But over time, I started to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She didn't speak as kindly, and there was a shift in the way she looked at me. It wasn't immediate, but the tension between us grew. The little moments of closeness we once shared started to feel distant. I could see it in her eyes. The disappointment, the frustration, maybe even fear. The person who had once been my biggest cheerleader was now pulling away. The strain of the situation began to show. As I scrambled to find work, I also struggled with the guilt of not being able to provide. I was doing everything I could, but it never seemed enough. The harder I tried, the further she seemed to drift. The silence between us grew heavier, and I could feel the emotional distance widening. I wanted to fix it, to prove that I was still the man she could count on, but I didn't know how. The longer I searched for a job, the more I realized something. I wasn't just fighting to find work. I was fighting to hold on to something slipping away. As the months went by, I struggled to find new work. The bills piled up, and with each passing day, my confidence crumbled further. I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty, fighting to keep my head above water, but every effort seemed in vain. The weight of the situation pressed on me harder than I could bear. Then one night, when the pressure was unbearable, she turned to me and said she couldn't handle the uncertainty anymore. She left, just like that, took everything, her presence, her support, her love, and walked out the door. I was left standing there, stunned and hollow. I didn't understand how she could walk away when I needed her the most. Hadn't we always promised to stick together through thick and thin? The vows we made in front of friends, family, and God, they meant nothing now. I was devastated, confused, and angry. The pain felt like a physical blow. How could the woman I thought would stand by me in the toughest times, who had always been my partner, just leave? The questions burned in my mind, but no answers came. I had always imagined that if things ever got difficult, we'd face it together. But here I was, alone, with no one to lean on. It felt like a betrayal, a wound that cut deeper with each passing day. The days that followed were a blur of disbelief and grief. I couldn't wrap my mind around how everything had crumbled so quickly. One moment, I had a steady job and a family by my side. The next, I was alone, with nothing but confusion and pain. My world had shifted on its axis, and I was left to pick up the pieces. The weight of it all felt unbearable, but I knew I had no choice but to keep going. Slowly I rebuilt, but the scars remained, and for years I wondered what had happened, what had caused her to leave. Life without her was hard, but I knew I couldn't give up. The pain of her departure was still fresh, and there were days when it felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. But I refused to stay down. I focused on getting back on my feet, determined to rebuild the life I had lost. I took odd jobs, applied for anything I could find, and kept pushing forward. The struggle was constant, but I was driven by the need to move on, to prove to myself that I could make it without her. Over time, things began to shift. I found a new job, one that paid well enough to provide for myself. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to keep me going. Each day, I became more confident in my ability to handle whatever came my way. Slowly, I started to heal. The anger and confusion that had consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance of my new reality. I had learned to stand on my own, and in doing so, I realized I was better off without her. Yet despite all the growth, a question still lingered in my mind. Why had she left when I needed her most? I may never get the answers I wanted, but I had found peace in the fact that I had learned to live without them. What mattered now was that I had made it. Have you ever had someone leave when you needed them most? Or maybe you've been through a tough time and had to rebuild on your own? Let me know your story in the comments. Sometimes the truth isn't what we think it is. Share your experiences and let's talk about how we move forward after life's hardest moments. Years later, I ran into her by chance. It was completely unexpected. I was going about my day when I turned a corner and saw her. She looked different, older, more tired. But there was something about her that immediately brought back a flood of memories. For a moment, it was like no time had passed at all, but then I saw it in her eyes. The regret. She tried to act casual, but I could tell that wasn't all she was feeling. She wasn't just looking at me. She was looking at the man I had become. We exchanged some awkward pleasantries, neither of us knowing how to navigate the situation. The silence between us spoke volumes, but eventually she suggested we sit down and talk. I didn't know what I was expecting, but something in me told me this conversation wasn't going to be as simple as catching up. I had no idea that the truth that would come out would shock me. As we talked, the layers of what happened between us began to peel away. She told me things that I hadn't known, things that made me realize there was more to her leaving than I had ever understood. There was a raw honesty in her voice that I hadn't heard in years, and as she spoke, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had been hurt. She had been carrying a weight of her own, one that had driven her to make the decisions she did. But even with that understanding, I couldn't help but feel like it was too little, too late. She confessed that her leaving wasn't just about me losing my job. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. She had already been seeing someone else before she left. All the time I spent thinking that losing my job was the reason for everything falling apart, that the strain of financial stress had driven her away, was shattered in an instant. She didn't want to admit it to herself, but she had been unhappy for a long time. Losing my job had been the perfect excuse, the justification she needed to finally leave, without facing the real reasons behind her decision. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have ever imagined. What I had thought was a difficult situation of misfortune, of life throwing us a curveball, turned out to be something far darker. I had been blind to the truth for so long, convinced that I had somehow failed her, or that things could have been different if only I had worked harder. But now, hearing her words, it became clear. It wasn't just about me losing my job. She had already checked out, emotionally and physically, long before the job loss. I had been blindsided by her departure, left to pick up the pieces of a life I thought was real. But sitting across from her, finally hearing the truth, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I may have been devastated by her leaving, but at least now I could see it for what it truly was. And that made all the difference. At that moment, I realized I had been living in the past, holding on to the wrong idea of what had really happened. For years, I let her leaving define me, letting it shape my self-worth and my future. I had thought it was about me losing my job, that somehow I had failed and that was why she left. But sitting there with her, hearing the truth, I understood that it wasn't about me at all. It was about her not being able to handle life's challenges. She had checked out long before I lost my job. The closure was bitter. There was no catharsis, no happy ending to the story I had imagined for so long. But in that bitter moment, I found something that had eluded me for years: freedom. I wasn't bound by the guilt, the confusion, or the resentment anymore. I walked away knowing that I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, on my own terms. Every step I took forward was my own choice, and every accomplishment was something I had earned through my strength. She was no longer a part of my life, and in the end, I realized that was exactly how I wanted it. I had let go of the past, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. The man I had become didn't need her, and I was finally okay with that. Finding out the truth about why she left was a painful but necessary step in my journey. It gave me the closure I never knew I needed, and I finally understood that my path forward didn't depend on her. Thanks for hearing my story. Remember, sometimes the hardest chapters lead us to the strongest versions of ourselves.